He's a millionaire CEO who has never looked back. She's the woman he left behind and the only one who can destroy him. Fate has decided to bring them face to face, and he's not prepared for what he feels when he sees her. If this kind of quiet, heartfelt reunion speaks to you, stay with the full story, subscribe and like to see more tales like this. Nathan Cole checked his reflection in the brass panel of the elevator and found the same practiced stillness he wore to boardrooms and press interviews. Mid-30s, suit tailored to the contour of control, he had taught himself to measure breath against decisions. Inhale, calendar. Exhale, command. The appointment in his phone read only a name he did not know, and the restaurant's address. Jason's laughter had prefaced the message, a dare disguised as friendship. Nathan slid a hand into his jacket and felt, tucked by chance or habit into an inner pocket, a small square of linen. It was not his. He realized with that sudden, inconvenient flutter that the cloth was a borrowed thing from his childhood, soft with age, embroidered by a summer that had nothing to do with spreadsheets. He could not remember when he'd last seen anything like it. The elevator chime sounded like punctuation. He told himself to be polite, to arrive, to close the margin between curiosity and embarrassment, and to let whatever the night held be, at most, an agreeable anecdote. Laia Hart arrived at the restaurant by way of a city bus that shuddered and sighed, dragging her nerves into daylight. She had straightened the single strand of hair that perpetually refused to cooperate, smoothed the sleeve of the dress she could afford to wear once in a while for interviews and substitute shifts, and held in the crook of her arm the smallest carrier bag, which contained nothing dramatic, only a packet of wipes, a tiny comb, and the handkerchief she owned that matched no celebration. She was late, as usual, because Lucy had spilled yogurt on the pink dress that morning, and Laia had traded her own scarce time for a last-minute wash. Pride made every delay a private confession. When she pushed inside and saw the table, she felt the particular stomach turn of recognition before her rational mind handed over the what and the how. Nathan Cole, name, face from another season, sharper now in the kind of light that city restaurants reserve for people who pay for the windows. Her breath found the same hitch it had when she'd been 9, and he'd stolen her pencil and then given it back with a joke. Memory tightened around the subtle line of his mouth. She folded the carrier bag against her ribs, the way one might shield a soft thing in public. Lucy's rabbit, long ago replaced, lived in that snugness of protective habit. Nathan saw first the tilt of her chin, then the salting of city light across hair that had once been plaited into braids they'd shared at the old oak behind their neighborhood. The handkerchief, stained faintly, frayed at one corner, sat on the table like a deliberate marker of time. His throat made a small, unfamiliar sound, and Jason, across the table with his usual half-grin, raised an eyebrow as if to say, "Well, there it is." Nathan had rehearsed an entry that would be casual, the casual that sealed conversation between people who had not been in one another's possession for years. The casual did not arrive. Instead, he reached for the linen without thinking, fingers closing around the embroidered corner, and remembering a summer sun the way one remembers a song. His mind supplied the rest. the swing of an oak branch, their laughter like two coins dropped into the same cup. He said nothing of those images. He asked, instead, as if testing the weather, "Do you remember the oak on 9th?" Laya's hand trembled when she tucked a stray lock behind her ear. Her voice answered before she had given herself permission to analyze the shock of familiarity. "We used to carve our initials on it. You made sure mine didn't look like a heart." She managed the smallness of laughter that was partly a shield. Something about the memory drained a color from her face. It was a safe color, one that did not show the erasure of recent months. She watched Nathan in the same way she had watched any adult from a distance, trying to gauge whether this recognition would be a mirror or a mirror with a crack. The linen in his hand felt to her like a relic of a childhood promise she had believed in before the city taught her about bills and hours and ways to hide the trembling. "You kept that," she said, and it sounded less like accusation than wonder. They moved through the early minutes on the rails of small talk, the way two people reconnecting across a canyon pick out footholds. Jason, delighted, poured wine as commentary. Nathan, careful, asked about common acquaintances in a way that skimmed the surfaces and avoided the swells below. Laya answered with abbreviated truth. She was working, mostly nights, sometimes 2 shifts, Lucy at home with Mia when she could arrange it. Every trimmed detail was chosen for protection. The restaurant's light softened faces into maps. Nathan noticed the way Laya's fingers worried a seam on her napkin, and, ineffably, his instinct to guard something old returned a fraction of himself he had not used in years. When rain began outside, the first drops whispered against the window like tentative messages. Laya's breath caught. It was a small human signal. She glanced toward the coat stand without consciously planning it, and noticed the expensive fringe of a designer coat draped over Nathan's chair. Old habits, protect, offer, retreat, moved in them both. Nathan saw the shiver in her shoulders and the way she tightened against herself when the glass fogged. He rose with the practiced ease of someone who manages crises, and made offers. "I left an umbrella in my car," he said before he could weigh it. The voice was low. To Jason it sounded like civility. To Laya it sounded like a choice. Laya considered saying no. Saying no had been a daily discipline. It kept pity distant and self-sufficiency intact. Saying yes risked the small betrayals pride kept as armor. But the umbrella, when it appeared beside them, felt like a way to travel the same path and remain separate enough to be safe. She accepted, and they left under the shared canopy of fabric and city light. Rain collected on the sidewalk in small gullies. A taxi splashed past and painted them briefly in streaks of gloss. Nathan asked, as if revisiting geography, "You live in the old district still?" Her answer named the street with economy. 3 rooms, a hallway lamp that sometimes flickered, and she watched him listen. He did not make a face at the practicalities. He did not pity. He only asked, "Is Lucy with you?" like a man measuring logistics rather than seconds. When she said yes, his expression found a softness that the boardroom never allowed. The walk to her building was short and smelled of wet concrete and roasted chestnuts from a vendor who kept his cart pitched near the corner. Nathan could have left the umbrella and his suit at the curb. Instead, when Laya's key slipped in the lock and the light in her stairwell flickered as it always did, he shrugged off his coat and held it out. The coat was heavy, warm. It smelled faintly of his apartment and of the city. And when Leia hesitated, she held the offered sleeve like an examination of a future she had not expected. Pride warred with tiredness, and, finally, the need to keep Lucy from catching cold won. She wrapped the coat around the smallness of her body, and in that action allowed something to change shape. Inside, the apartment was honest in its modesty. A kitchenette that announced itself with the sound of a faucet. Toys lined along a windowsill like sentinels, a lavender stain on the rug where juice had dried weeks before. A stuffed rabbit, hair a little thin on one ear, one eye frayed with love, sat on the couch. Leia's breast tightened around a private grief when she saw Nathan glance at it. Lucy's absence at that moment was an ache. Nathan, meanwhile, watched how the space carried stories. Scribbled letters on the fridge, a calendar with scribbled shifts, bills folded under a jar lid. He did not ask questions meant to expose. He asked instead, "Is she asleep?" Leia's answer arrived in a whisper that might have been a joke if she had had room for humor. "Night shift at daycare," she said, and felt ridiculous for saying it. The truth was a knot of necessity and fear. When Lucy's cough had flared in the last fortnight, Leia had missed 2 shifts to be with her, and then had worked extra nights to cover the rent. She had been saving every spare dollar for a small buffer that somehow never took shape. Pride, old, precise, kept her from naming the debt collectors who had begun to call. When Nathan reached into his phone and offered instead, in a fragment of movement that belonged more to habit than theater, to help with the pharmacy bill, Leia bristled. She had been raised on the quiet creed that asks for help only when the asking would not cause harm. Accepting would rearrange her identity. Nathan's offer was small and practical. He did not speak in platitudes. "Give me the name and I'll cover it," he said. "No questions, no ceremony." The absence of spectacle made his words heavier, ironed flat by intention. Leia looked at the man across from her, at the edges of his jaw softened by worry, and thought of the oak, the summer, the childish promise of always. She also thought of the last time she had trusted someone with a future, and how that trust had frayed into a debt and a bruise. For a long beat she considered a lie. It's fine. And then, for reasons she could not name cleanly, she swallowed it. "Okay," she said. "Pharmacy is down on 3rd. Lucy needs the inhaler refilled." Later, when Nathan walked out into the rain with an umbrella and a small receipt in his hand, Jason clapped his shoulder with the clumsy approval of a friend who liked results. "So," Jason asked, grinning like a man who arranged fortunes for amusement. Nathan folded the linen he had kept with an absent, almost reverent care. The memory of a child running against an oak tree sat in him now like a hinge that might open something. He was used to opening companies. He had not practiced opening the small, fragile economies of another person's life. It felt, when he stepped back into the taxi, like learning to breathe in a room with different air. Leia watched Nathan go from the top of her stairs, the coat around her shoulders, as if the gesture had been a blessing. She told herself it was nothing but kindness extended across a rainy night, and yet the warmth of the fabric against her neck suggested more than charity. She made tea with hands that worried considerations into knots. When she tucked Lucy into bed later, smoothing the thin hair over a small forehead, Leah studied the rabbit's lopsided smile and wondered how much of the city's cruelty was inherited and how much could be unsubscribed with a steady hand. The city felt both large and suddenly navigable by different means. Help had arrived that night in a coat. Nathan's apartment was minimal in the way of someone who owned much and trusted little to keep. On his nightstand, under the lamp, the handkerchief lay folded like a question. He thought about the small exchanges he had orchestrated in the course of a career, an acquisition there, an apology there, loyalty obtained with the currency of reliability. Leah's world was different currency. Time spent at the bedside of a sick child, pride bartered for survival. He recognized that he had stepped into a contour of need he had not imagined occupying, and instead of stepping back, his instincts oddly and stubbornly tilted toward making room. Leah watched Nathan go from the top of her stairs, the coat around her shoulders, as if the gesture had been a blessing. She told herself it was nothing but kindness extended across a rainy night, and yet the warmth of the fabric against her neck suggested more than charity. She made tea with hands that worried considerations into knots. When she tucked Lucy into bed later, smoothing the thin hair over a small forehead, Leah studied the rabbit's lopsided smile and wondered how much of the city's cruelty was inherited and how much could be unsubscribed with a steady hand. The city felt both large and suddenly navigable by different means. Help had arrived that night in a coat. Nathan's apartment was minimal in the way of someone who owned much and trusted little to keep. On his nightstand, under the lamp, the handkerchief lay folded like a question. He thought about the small exchanges he had orchestrated in the course of a career, an acquisition there, an apology there, loyalty obtained with the currency of reliability. Leah's world was different currency. Time spent at the bedside of a sick child, pride bartered for survival. He recognized that he had stepped into a contour of need he had not imagined occupying, and instead of stepping back, his instincts, oddly and stubbornly, tilted toward making room.
Over the next days, the city arranged for them to cross paths with the persistence of fate or of friends who liked meddling. Victoria appeared as a social vector at a gallery opening, a woman for whom connections were a domesticated species. She delivered an invitation to a charity brunch with the precise, benign look of someone who enjoyed setting scenes. Jason texted Nathan a link to an article about the neighborhood's gentrification, as if to say their histories were now headlines. Leah bumped into Victoria at the laundromat when she had gone to salvage a load of Lucy's clothes after the dryer had eaten a sock. Victoria, fresh and slightly apologetic for the brusque way wealth sometimes drummed people into categories. Conversation there was short and practical. Victoria offered help that sounded like a thread, a temporary nanny placement through a friend, a reference to a clinic that took sliding scale fees. Leah accepted the information the way one accepts rain when there is no umbrella, gratefully but wary of the current that follows. They began to fold care into the small architecture of life. Nathan paid a pharmacy bill with quiet precision and avoided announcing the transaction. He authorized a one-time payment through an app and let details remain anonymous because he resented spectacle. Leah found the envelope in her mailbox, no note, no flourish, and for the first time in months could buy groceries without weighing every item against rent. She left a thank you sticky note on the pharmacy counter the next day, and the pharmacist, used to gestures of strangers, smirked at the discretion of it all. The economy of gratitude that followed was awkward and humble. Leah wanted to refuse the favor the way one refuses pity. Instead, she sent Nathan an SMS that said only, "Thanks," which in her vocabulary was confessionally close to, "I need you to be here." Nathan read the message and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with philanthropy. It was closer to recognition that he had arrived at a place he had not intended to sell. He had been raised on the ethic of competence: solve the problem, move on. Leah's life was an array of inconveniences that could not be neatly solved, and he found that he did not want to solve them for the feeling of power it gave him. He wanted to be there, present and steady, as presence. The difference was subtle but seismic. It meant listening without an agenda, offering without control, and asking questions that did not demand an answer. As the weeks folded into one another, Lucy became, in the way small children do, the axis around which their cautious intimacy spun. Nathan learned the rhythm of toddler bedtime, how many stories before a yawn tipped into sleep, which lullaby chased away a cough, and Leah watched him with a guarded astonishment.
She had expected grand gestures, if anything. She had not expected the patience of someone who could hold a storybook on his lap and look at a rubber duck as if the object contained currency. Once, when Lucy woke with a fever, and Leah's calm frayed into the edges of panic, Nathan held the small phone call to the clinic for her and arranged for a same-day appointment. He did not carry a card marked "Benefactor." He simply drove them to the clinic and waited in the plastic chairs until Leah emerged with a relief that looked like a child let out of a too-tight sleeve. Mark's name arrived as an aftertaste, mentioned first by Mia over coffee, then by a landlord's offhand remark that grew teeth when a notice slipped under Leah's door. Mark, Lucy's father, had drifted in and out of their lives with the inconsistency of bad weather. Sometimes there with apologies, sometimes absent, sometimes prone to temper the size of which Leah remembered in the hush of nights when she could not sleep. He owed money, according to the hush-hush chatter of acquaintances, and his presence now carried a different impressiveness, entitlement sharpened by anger. When a man begins to count another's kindness as a ledger, the sums can turn dangerous. When Mark first appeared on the periphery in person, leaning against a brownstone stoop, hood drawn up, eyes sharp like flint, Leah's spine folded back into old self-protecting angles. He said nothing at first that was criminal. His words were the kind that smooth into manipulation. "You always did like the fancy things," he said once, as if Nathan were the occasion of the world's injustice. Leah felt the old shame stir, the private ledger that aligned every small kindness with an indebtedness that hummed with terror. Nathan saw the exchange from a distance, the way one watches a chessboard and notices when a pawn moves with an inattentive hand. He felt, in a clear reflex that surprised him, the sudden and immediate urge to intervene. His intervention was not grand. It began with a voice that was low and measured, the voice he used when danger required containment rather than spectacle. "This is not the way to speak here," he told Mark, and the man flinched because he had been expecting to be answered by fear or silence. Nathan asked no permission to position himself between Mark and Leah. He simply drew a line with the kind of calm that often undoes bluster. Mark tested the line with a shove of words, insults, claims. It did not cross the line. Nathan offered instead to pay Mark what was owed, but not as an admission of guilt, as a practical reallocation so that Lucy's life could be steady. The offer was a soft administrative blow,
precise, non-emotional. Mark refused, as men like him often do, because pride cements refusal. The exchange ended with a legal advisor's suggestion that sounded much less romantic than it read in law books. Restraining order, documented threats, proof.
Meio. Mantenha o fluxo e a conexão. Conecte com. Meio. Mantenha o fluxo e a conexão. Conecte com. Nathan arranged the first contact with a lawyer who could make lines into barriers. Laya agreed, with the stunned gratitude of someone whose life had been salvaged from erosion by a carefully placed stone. It was not that Nathan wanted to own or fix Laya's life. It was that he did not want to witness harm without describing it in terms the law could contain. When the first official letter arrived, served by an agent and sealed with a legal stamp, Laya gripped it like someone holding a life preserver. It had the blunt, bureaucratic kindness of procedures. It also had weight. It named behavior and prohibited proximity, and it put Mark in a position of choice he did not like. He raged in conversations that were overheard, in sulks that edged toward threats. But each time that happened, Nathan responded with the quiet efficiency of someone who had resources and believed in their modest use. He did not parade power. He secured it and then offered the advantage in ways that preserved dignity. Between the procedural and the tender, they built a rhythm that allowed small intimacies. Grocery runs that Nathan accompanied, the two of them choosing bread and fruit as if choosing neutral currency. A Saturday where Nathan sat with Lucy in the park and taught her how to blow bubbles without insisting on mastery. Laya watching him watch her child and learning how to accept that another adult could be reliable without wanting possession in return. In quieter moments, they returned to the oak conversation. Nathan found himself several times visiting the old park with Lucy in a stroller. He dug his fingers into the bark of the oak as if to check its solidity, and remembered where a boy had once promised constancy with childish swagger. The oak had grown. The initials that had once been crisp were softened by weather. The symbol hurt in a good way. The real test came one evening when Mark's threat took a tangible shape. He appeared on the street outside Laya's apartment in a way that was not casual. He came with two men who read like purpose. When Laya saw them through the peephole, something like time narrowed. She called Nathan with a voice crusted around fear. He arrived within minutes, breathless not from the speed, but from the urgency of intention. The confrontation happened in the corridor, the place where private lives touch public landings and where neighbors can divide with the polite indifference of the city. Words flew, Mark leaning into the old entitlement, Nathan holding a steady, articulating line that left no room for theatrics. The two men at Mark's side were the kind who measured advantage and withdrew when the cost exceeded the promise. A neighbor later described the scene as a blur. A man in a suit stepping calmly between a woman and a danger, saying, "Leave her alone," as if every world had that simple clause. Nathan's action was not a dramatic physical rescue. It was a layering of legal notice, of documented presence, of visible care that made predators check their arithmetic. Mark left that night with curses that dissolved into threats that would eventually be addressed in filings. He came back twice, each time pushed further by the glass wall of legal consequence. In the third instance, a restraining order was in place, and Mark found his options limited to revenge that had no room in a city that had mapped the lines. When he crossed them, he discovered the law would be the smaller partner in his undoing. The community, the neighbors who had seen too much or cared enough, offered testimony that made his path narrower. The threats waned like a bad storm. After the emergency eased, the city resumed its normal noise, but the interior lives of Nathan and Leah had been rearranged by events both harsh and clarifying. They had endured a confrontation that forced loyalty into public lines and trust into legal documents. What the court could not prescribe, however, was the shape of forgiveness and the slow enabling of intimacy. That remained the work of small decisions, Nathan learning to ask instead of assuming, Leah learning to accept steadiness without translating it into a new kind of prison. They rebuilt together through rituals that were practical rather than theatrical. Phones left on when Lucy slept, calendar entries for doctor visits that Nathan offered to coordinate, an agreement that financial help would come with autonomy intact. One night, months into this new, fragile architecture, Nathan and Leah sat on the low wall of the park under the oak. Lucy chased pigeons with reckless joy. Her rabbit was clutched to her chest. The sunset painted them in long, forgiving lines. Nathan handed Leah the handkerchief, the same linen that had begun their reconnection, and she unfolded it with careful hands. It had a new crease in it, a seam mended perhaps by Nathan himself, or perhaps by habit. The two of them sat with the silence that follows a confession and is kinder than words. "I thought this might always be a memory," Nathan said. He did not promise repairs he could not deliver. He promised presence in the soft, exact language of a man who had learned the value of small things. Leah looked at him, at the coat slung across his shoulders like an offered shelter that had gradually become commonplace rather than charity. She felt for the first time in years the possibility of a different ledger, one that balanced kindness and agency. The past had come back to haunt them, yes, but it had also been given a frame in which it could be named and set aside. They had weathered the storm with legal restraining orders and neighbor testimony and the hard work of people who choose to show up. The oak above them rustled. Lucy laughed. Nathan reached for Leah's hand with a steadiness that had nothing to do with press releases and everything to do with a willingness to stay. She slid her fingers into his and did not pull away. There would still be days when the city bit. Bills would still be tallied, and schedules would still require negotiation. Mark might yet find new ways to resent what he could not possess. But into the small ledger of Leah's life, Nathan had deposited something durable. Not a rescue, but a partnership. For Nathan, the deposit had been transformative. He had learned that safeguarding another's dignity sometimes meant stepping back, sometimes stepping forward, and mostly holding a steady line. In the end, their reunion was less a story of theatrical redemption and more a composition of little acts. Paying for a prescription without a headline, showing up at a clinic and leaving with nothing to prove, filing a restraining order and then renovating the small rituals of childcare. The love that returned was not an all-consuming blaze, but a steady light that made practical things possible.
When the season turned, the two of them walked through the park hand in hand. Lucy with her rabbit and a new jacket that fit her shoulders like a promise. They paused by the oak and traced the carved initials, softened by time, like any true testimony. Nathan, who had made a career of reducing risk, had learned to live with the risk of vulnerability. Laya, who had long equated asking with weakness, had learned that vulnerability could be chosen and shaped. The city around them hummed its indifferent song, but inside the circle of their small family, order had been reassembled in the steady architecture of care. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing for more gentle, real-world romances, and leave a comment about a small kindness that changed your life. Like and share to give someone else a moment of hope. Spring folded into early summer with a series of small tests that were not dramatic so much as revealing. Nathan learned that steadiness could be boring in the best sense. The grocery list brought home without commentary. The same mug put in the sink for Lucy to reach. A voicemail left at 8:30 saying only, "I'm on my way." Laya learned to receive help as a form of trust, not a ledger to be balanced by future indignities. They kept the language of boundaries simple and practiced it more than they argued it. Phrases like, "Is this okay?" and "Tell me when you want me to stop" became their new punctuation. Lucy, who had a way of naming the weather of the house by the sound of the kettle, took to bringing gifts from the park. A smooth pebble, a dried blade of grass, a crumpled ticket from the ice cream truck. She taught them, without ceremony, how ordinary reparations accumulate into safety. Nathan and Laya found that their biggest reconciliations were invisible. An unlocked bedroom door, a calendar entry left unpoliced, the quiet competence of shared errands. Neighbors noticed, not in the way that gossip visits and then departs, but in the slow recalibration of everyday interactions. Mrs. Alvarez from 3 doors down stopped by with lemon bars and sat on the stoop like a judge of small mercies. "You two seem calmer," she said once, adjusting her shawl. Nathan, who had grown used to taking on the world as a matrix of avoidable hazards, smiled and answered with a truth that belonged to ordinary people. "We're learning to show up." Mark's presence remained a low, intermittent pressure. Court dates, the occasional message filtered through a lawyer, a rumor that he had moved to a new building across town. Once, on an afternoon when Lucy had traced patterns on the fogged-up window, and Nathan had been at work late, a delivery arrived with a bouquet of flowers and a note that had been intercepted and catalogued into evidence. It was an old kind of menace, the attempt to re-enter through beauty. Laya burned the note in the sink, watched the paper curl into ash, and then folded the flowers into the compost with the same economy of motion she used to fold laundry. That was one of the modest victories. She could choose the scale of Mark's importance in the life that stretched between her and her daughter. There were other victories that felt less like endings and more like openings. Lucy's school held a small recital. She performed a poem about the sun and the way it comes back even when a cloud hides it. Nathan, who had avoided being visible for months, sat in the second row with his knees pressed together, his hands in his lap. Laya watched him watching Lucy. He clapped as if his palms might break the sound into pieces Lucy could collect. Afterwards, when Lucy ran to them with the raw fervor of a child who had conquered something bright, Nathan lifted her up so her feet dangled. "You were a comet," he told her.
And Leah, in that instant, felt gratitude for the modest metaphors that stitched them whole. Work offered its own rehearsal of trust. Nathan's job required careful assessments and clean reports. It did not forgive emotional improvisation. He began to bring the same honesty to his professional life that he had taught himself at home, admitting mistakes, asking for help on tasks he would once have guarded jealously. The result surprised him. Colleagues found him steadier, not weaker. Leah, who had returned to part-time shifts at the clinic, found that patients trusted someone whose life had scars, but whose hands remained gentle. They both discovered that competence and tenderness were not opposites. One humid evening, after Lucy had been put to bed with a detail of extra pillows and the leftover bite of banana bread, Nathan and Leah sat on the living room floor amid open boxes of photographs.
They had been sorting images.